Brad, if you can flip that computer over to presentation there. Excellent, thank you. All right, let's open up to Jeremiah chapter 38. Jeremiah chapter 38, that's where we're picking up. We're in lesson 10 in our material. If you're visiting with us, we have several extras available there in the back that you're welcome to. In opening up, I said chapter 38, I mean chapter 37. Chapter 37, we're going to be looking here at these couple of chapters that have a lot of parallels as we look at chapter 37 and 38. And I think a lot of people would put these two chapters in sort of actually parallel accounts. Like here's one account and then here's another account. But I think there's too many distinctions. Additionally, we're going to see some things that go on here in chapter 37 that sound a little bit like some things that happened earlier. But I think the point is not necessarily that they are two separate accounts of the same thing happening, but rather two similar things that happen that get set side by side as the book of Jeremiah is compiled and put together for the reader. And so we'll make note of that as we go along, of course. All right, so opening up in Jeremiah chapter 37, we get a time marker, which is very important as we've just come off chapter 36. Who is on the throne as we begin chapter 37, Brad?
Zedekiah, the way it reads here, Zedekiah the son of Josiah reigned instead of Coniah the son of Jehoiakim. So it sounds to me as if this is relatively quickly after Coniah has abdicated.
Yeah, all right, so we're back to the beginning of the projector's not on, Brad. If you could also do that for me. If you could do 4 or 5 jobs back there, that would be great. So it sounds like we're back at the beginning of Zedekiah's reign. But now remember, in the previous chapter, in chapter 36, who was on the throne? Remember what happened there with the penknife? Jehoiakim was on the throne. We were at the beginning, right? Not just the beginning of the siege. We were all the way at the beginning of captivity, right? The first wave, right there about the first wave of captivity. That's when that whole penknife and the destruction of the word of the Lord happened with Jehoiakim. Now we're thrust back to Zedekiah, but we're not thrust all the way back into the siege. That is one marker, as Brad just noted, that it says, it makes the connection here with the son of Josiah, and instead of Coniah, he's been set on the throne. That sounds like the beginning. But also we're going to see Jeremiah was not imprisoned yet, which also seems to indicate, that's yet to come. And of course, that's going to be coming both here in chapter 37 as well as chapter 38. Now, what is going on at this point around Jerusalem? Or very quickly after this? Right, but in the context of that, this kind of gets into the next question, Seth, and this is yours. Who comes onto the scene besides the Chaldeans here in this context?
Withdraw, yeah, take care of that issue. And then Jeremiah tells him, he said, don't put your trust in the Egyptians. Chaldeans are going to destroy Jerusalem. Even if you defeat their army, the wounded will come back and destroy the city.
Yeah, and that final word there at the end of that section in verse 10, even if you go out and fight them, even if you win somehow against the Babylonians, whoever's left would come in and burn the city down. In other words, there is no way out, right? Not even through some heroic effort of yours, there's no path out of the destruction that's been proclaimed by the Lord. Now remember what we talked about as we were looking just a couple of chapters back at the proclamation that Zedekiah made for the release of the captives in obedience to God's commands, right? So release the captives, and they did that so very briefly, and then immediately they went back. And I mentioned there that it may be in connection to what we're seeing right here. Release the captives, then the Babylonians go away. There's a short reprieve because of Egypt, and that would fit very well with the notion of, okay, well, now we got some relief, and we're going to take the captives and put them right back where they were. That would be very much in keeping with the behavior that they've had. All right, now, when Jeremiah gives that warning, it is in response to Zedekiah sending some men to Jeremiah. And when those men come to Jeremiah, what do they want from him? What's Zedekiah's request from Jeremiah?
Pray to the Lord on their behalf.
Yeah, pray for us, please. Now, as we've been reading in the book of Jeremiah and concerning prayers for the children of Israel, what have we seen God repeatedly say about prayers? Don't. And I think that's of interest, and I think it's important for us to see that the foundation has been laid, right? Jeremiah has recorded those messages from God that were straight to him for the reader, I think, all right, as this is laid out. So when we get to this very late stage, and now Zedekiah is coming and saying, please pray for us, it's on the heels of Jeremiah having repeatedly told us that God has said, don't. And so I think what we see is it's that Jeremiah has been prepared for this moment, right? That he's been prepared for the moment when they would finally come, when now the enemies are literally at the gates, then they'd come and ask you to pray. And so Jeremiah's already been repeatedly warned, don't fall for that, right? Now, on the other hand, for the reader, we're also prepared for this moment, right? So it's not just Jeremiah that's been prepared, but we've been prepared. Israel, who would be reading this, would be prepared as they're being told this in a fashion that they can learn something from it. So here, I think one of the things that we ought to learn is what it looks like to come way too late asking finally for God's blessings when you haven't been interested in anything God has to say up to this point. And I think we're going to continue to see that as we look at especially the character and the behavior of Zedekiah. Well, as we continue on there in chapter 37, picking up in verse 11, what happens next? So we're still under this reprieve where the Chaldeans have been taken away by Pharaoh. Incidentally, just thinking about that particular moment, let me just throw this in. We do have historical time markers here. Sometimes you wonder, how do we date things in the Bible? And there can be some difficulty there from time to time. This is one of those moments. Herodotus, who's just a secular historian, gives us this moment in history that's recorded of Egypt coming up and challenging Babylon. And so we get those time markers. We have the same sort of thing in the New Testament. It's one of the things that sets the Bible firmly in known history, right? These are not fairy tales and so forth. So we can have an idea as to timeline. This is why it's, sometimes you get such precise numbers. It's not just people throwing out guesses. All right, nevertheless, the Babylonians have been distracted away from the walls of Jerusalem to go out and meet the Egyptians, who are formidable, but that is going to be temporary, just as Jeremiah has prophesied. They're going to go back right to where they came from, and the Babylonians are going to be back very quickly. So during that reprieve, Jeremiah takes an opportunity to do what?
To go up to the land of Benjamin and claim that property that he had purchased.
Okay, all right. That's possible, right? It is possible that it is that property that he purchased. I do want to suggest a difficulty. Somebody needs to let somebody in back there. I do want to suggest that as you look at the two accounts, right? So he's told to go buy the property over here, right? And now we're talking about before imprisonment, which sounds like this happened before that. This may be another occasion, right? Where there's even other property involved that Jeremiah is going to claim. So it could be that it's happening after that, and now we're getting the second story, or it could just be another occasion where Jeremiah is going out to claim some property that is rightfully his. Well, he comes out to the Benjamin gate, and the watchman of the gate, Elijah, he sees him, and what's his response to that?
You're defecting.
Yeah, all right. So, a deserter, a defector, right? You're going over to the enemy. Now, think about that in a couple of contexts. First of all, think about it in the context of everything Jeremiah is saying. Would his leaving and going over to the Babylonians be inconsistent with everything he's been preaching? No, he's not a hypocrite. I mean, even if the charge was true, it's not, but even if the charge were true, Jeremiah would only be practicing what he's been preaching the whole time, which is telling the people to surrender. So even that doesn't make a very good charge in this particular case, because that's exactly what Jeremiah has been counseling the people to do. Incidentally, as we get on into the next couple of chapters, we're going to see some Israelites some people of Judah seem to have already obeyed. Because when we get to Zedekiah's final days in Jerusalem, one of the things that he's worried about is being handed over to the people who have already gone over to the Babylonians. So we haven't seen that yet, but it sounds like that has already happened. All right. Nevertheless, it's not what Jeremiah is doing. But let's think about it from the perspective of Israel. When you read military history, well, if you read military history, but when you read that sort of a history, what do you typically think of the people who bail? Yeah. And the punishment for that throughout really all of history is pretty much universal, which is what? Yeah. There is no quarter for that. And so I do want to appreciate and understand from the inhabitant of Jerusalem's perspective. If you're thinking in patriotic terms, right? If you're not paying attention to everything Jeremiah said, and if you're only thinking in normal terms that most people in most nations throughout all of history have thought, this is a pretty reasonable take. To be angry and want punishment for somebody who is leaving at the moment of crisis. Now, again, it's not true. And so Jeremiah makes his proclamations that it's not true. It doesn't matter. He is arrested and he is thrown into prison, it says, in the house of Jonathan, which is important at least from the standpoint of making some clarity between this occasion and the occasion in chapter 38. So he's thrown there into that prison, and Zedekiah, well, I've just answered the question there, but Zedekiah sends to Jeremiah to come, and what is he hoping to gain from a meeting with Jeremiah, Brent?
Well, he asked Jeremiah, is there any word from the Lord? Of course, Jeremiah says, yes, there is. And the word from the Lord is that you're going to fall to Babylon. And then Jeremiah goes on to say, look, what have I done against you? You put me in prison, but I've not done anything against you or your people. And he asked of him, please take me out of the house of the Jonathan the scribe, that I may not die there.
Yeah. All right. And that last part there, again, let's keep that in mind for when we get to the end of chapter 38. But there's a couple of things about that interaction. It reminds me a little bit of Balaam, who says basically, I don't have different words. I can only speak what comes from the Lord. But what's the difference between Jeremiah and Balaam?
wants the true, Jeremiah wants the true word.
Yeah, Jeremiah's not trying to find a way out of speaking the words of the Lord. He loves the Lord and wants to proclaim that truth. And so that is the great distinction. He's not trying to figure out a way to get the rewards. I will say this is one of the few occasions where you see Jeremiah pleading for himself. For the most part, he himself doesn't come into the equation. And even here, he is pleading for his life. But even in the pleading for his life, he has spoken the truth, right? He's not been willing to change that to get out of the threat to his life. And so it's extraordinary both that it's such a unique thing that he would plead for his life, but it's also comes alongside and needs to be recognized that he's unwilling to compromise in order to get that from Zedekiah. Now, what is Zedekiah's response to his plea for that?
Yeah, he lets him go back into the court of the gatekeeper, the gatehouse, and says, feed him a loaf of bread every day until there's no bread left.
That's right. In other words, he's going to be fed as well as is possible, right? And as long as there's food to feed him, we're going to feed him. And there seems to be a protection there. It does seem to be an upgrade from where he was imprisoned. And so, again, we see that kind of wishy-washiness of Zedekiah here, especially at the end, that we're going to continue to see moving forward. Okay, so that brings us to the end of chapter 37. We come to the beginning of chapter 38, where we have another occasion of imprisonment. And what does that look like? Where is he imprisoned?
Lowered down into a cistern.
All right, lowered down into a cistern. And what's at the bottom of that cistern? Mud. All right, the water's dried up, but there's nothing but mud, and he sinks down, it tells us. And so you can imagine just being in that continually, right? It would be one thing, like most of us might think that's gross in the first instance, but we deal with it, right? But just always being in that, never to have firm footing under your feet, never to be able to sit on dry ground. A lot of difficulty there is being suggested. Now, what's the charge against him?
Well, he's been telling them the city's going to go into the hands of the Babylonians. You need to turn around and give yourself up to them so that you'll be saved and not destroyed.
Yes.
And one thing to note, I think it's interesting, it says here that they cast him into the cistern, but how they cast him, they laid him down with ropes.
Yeah.
He was still taken care of. God protected him, Jeremiah was still there.
Yeah.
With them doing it the way that they did.
Right. And I think it's interesting they let him down with ropes, but we're going to note that he's taken even more care of coming out. So he does go down in, and I wonder, why are they taking any care with him? Well, obviously there's the thought of providential care, but also there may be, one of the things that is suggested frequently with regards to wicked men like this is there is superstition, and this is historically documented through rabbinical works and so forth. There's superstition of killing a prophet of God. There's superstition of the taking of innocent blood. Like this is the chief among the sins. And so just like with Jesus, there was a need to at least make a pretense of trying to avoid being the ones of taking the innocent blood themselves. And so maybe we're in a similar situation where they've certainly put him somewhere where he's going to die, but maybe there's at least one step removed, like we didn't actually slit his throat. And they might feel justified in that sort of thing. Now, again, going back to what we just said, Brad, first of all.
Just a comparison, you made some comments with regard to Zedekiah's character already. A little bit of comparison between him and his brother. Jehoiakim had no problem having a prophet of God, chased down to Egypt and brought back and killed. So Zedekiah is still not a good man, but at least in some ways he was not as bad as his brother.
Right, he seems troubled, right? At least in his conscience. It's not completely seared with a hot iron, we might say. Now, as far as what Jeremiah has been speaking, again, he has been preaching surrender. Now, in thinking about that, one of the things that one of the points of history, as far as military history especially goes, that I like to read most about is World War II. I like a lot of the characters, but I like Winston Churchill most of all, and reading what he had to say in that moment. And really, most of the world was saying the kinds of things, if you'll pardon the comparison here, that Jeremiah was saying. The French, I was just reading about this yesterday. The French, everyone assumed that there was no way that the Germans could march through, including Hitler was not sure. He had given orders to his men, at the first sign of resistance, you come back. And they didn't give the first sign of resistance. They were so worn out from World War I that they just thought the best thing is just let this man walk through and get it over as quickly as possible. And we look at that history, and what do we think? What are your thoughts on when you read that history? Cowards. What is their problem? They offered not the first bit of resistance. And we feel that deeply, strongly. And here is Jeremiah saying, don't offer the first bit of resistance. Open the gates and let them walk in. Can you imagine how hard it would be to overcome that natural instinct to think, that's the last thing. I will fight to the death. That's what I love to hear Churchill say. I don't care if we all die. We're going to fight. But he also had a sense we were in the right. And ultimately, the problem for these people is they are not in the right. And they're not fighting for what's right. They're only fighting for pride, for the comforts, but not for righteousness or anything approaching it. And so I just want to say that not from the standpoint of trying to justify or sympathize with the people who are throwing Jeremiah in because they have the truth, they know the truth, but it just from the standpoint of understanding how hard it would be to swallow the pill that Jeremiah is offering, especially to people who have not been listening to God all along. Tony?
Well, of course, in Jeremiah's case, he's not doing this in any way in regard to military strategy.
Right.
This has nothing to do with, this will be the best.
It's not just practically right.
Yeah, this is not the best thing we can do. It was all, this is the word of the Lord. That was all they had to do.
Yeah. And so they should have had confidence. And we'll see that with Zedekiah. He ought to have had confidence in what Jeremiah had to say.
I mean, Jeremiah had been vindicated
Yes.
up to this point by everything he said so far.
Right. All right. So we got another character that comes onto the scene. Who comes to Zedekiah concerning what's happened to Jeremiah? Ebed-Melech. Anybody know what Ebed-Melech means?
Servant king.
Yeah, or servant of the king is probably the way that would be translated. So Melech is king, Ebed would be the servant there. So the servant of the king. Now, who is Ebed-Melech description-wise?
An Ethiopian.
He's an Ethiopian and maybe a eunuch. That's uncertain. The word there that describes him is officer, and that could be translated as eunuch. It is translated eunuch some places, but it's not necessarily. It's the same word that describes Potiphar, who we know was not a eunuch. He was married, certainly. And so maybe he is, maybe he isn't, but it certainly would be quite a connection if he is to have an Ethiopian eunuch here coming to the aid of Jeremiah. What he certainly is not, as an Ethiopian, is what? from the standpoint of Jerusalem? He's not a Jew, right? And so when we see the one who is providing this aid and comfort here to Jeremiah, it is not from his own people. It's not from any faithfulness among the Jews, but rather it comes from outside. Here's a Gentile who is the servant of the king, who comes and provides salvation for Jeremiah. Now, what do we see as far as what precautions he takes and so forth? I mean, there's a lot of detail here, kind of like, you feel like maybe even unnecessary, but it gives you a couple of verses to tell you what he does in order to get Jeremiah out.
The ropes under his
Yeah, so it tells us that he goes and he gets some rags and he gets some worn out clothes and he brings those, and it says he lowers those down and he tells Jeremiah to put them under his arms in order to keep the ropes from doing more damage. And so again, I compare that, maybe there's a comparison to be made so that we understand that the people, while lowering him down with a rope, certainly might have kept him from being killed. It wasn't kindness, because it's compared here. This is what kindness looks like, right? So it's not, maybe it's to show that these people lowering him down weren't being so careful as to not hurt him. They just didn't want to kill him. But here's a man who doesn't want to hurt him. And so what do? Well, this is what you do if you really don't want to hurt somebody. And so bring him back out with that extra kindness.
This will be a worse situation than lowering him.
Right. Yes. Yeah, so more potential damage to be done there. Leonard?
I just find it in the verses right before in the previous question, they asked the king, did they not, about what they could do with Jeremiah, and he says, he's in your hands,
Yeah.
do what you want to, and now you see him with his servant requesting that, and he says, takes 30 men and go get him out.
Mm.
And it's just a picture of total indecision on his part, or that he doesn't want to blow any opportunity for somebody, whether it's a false god, whether it is the true God. I'm going to keep all my options open.
Yes, I think that's a good description, keeping all the options open. And he does. He says, in fact, explicitly there in verse 5, the king can do nothing against you. What a thing for a king to say. What a weak moment for that king. And then even here, he tells Ebed-Melech, he says, go get 30 men. And so basically, go, if you could go raise up a guard, I mean, sure, go. I'm not going to stop you. So I'm not going to stop anybody from doing what they want to do. And he just kind of lets the wind blow where it will. All right. That brings us down to, he is pulled out, and now we have another meeting with Zedekiah. And what's that meeting look like, Chase?
Well, Jeremiah tells Zedekiah that he needs to surrender to the Babylonians, and if he does, Zedekiah's city and house will stand. But if he does not surrender, then the city will be burnt up, and Zedekiah himself will not escape the hands of his enemies. This strikes fear into Zedekiah, and he's even afraid of the Jews who have defected to the Chaldeans, and that they might turn him over to them. Jeremiah reassures him that they will not deliver him, and pleads with Zedekiah to obey and surrender to God, so that he would not punish him. So Zedekiah sends Jeremiah off and tells him not to repeat this to anyone else.
All right, yeah. So we've got, the same message with a little bit more specificity concerning Zedekiah. Zedekiah is worried about what not the Babylonians will do to him, but about what his own people would do to him. Now, that's not entirely unreasonable in most nations, especially pagan nations. When a city was defeated, they would do terrible things to their own king, and usually the invading forces would let them do terrible things because it was his failure. We're told that the women would mock and laugh, and did mock and laugh at Zedekiah for his powerlessness to protect them. He is a weak man. In so many ways, he shows himself, as we've just suggested, to be a weak man. But in so many ways, he represents unfaithful Israel, who has repeatedly been worried. When they don't trust God, they're worried about things that are going to happen. And usually when Israel doesn't trust God and worries that something's going to happen to them, what ends up happening? The very thing they're afraid of, right? And so that's essentially what's going to happen to Zedekiah. He is going to be mocked by his own people, but he's also going to be sorely treated by the Babylonians because he would not listen here. Now, he is told, as Chase mentioned, don't tell them about any of this, and he does give him a story to feed. What's the story?
Tell them that you were just making an appeal to me to get you out of prison.
All right, yeah. Just tell him you don't want... Now, if we go back to 37, we do know that at that occasion, that is what Jeremiah said, right? All right. So that brings us here to the end of chapter 38. He does go out, he is questioned, and what does he tell the questioners?
What is commanded by the king?
Yeah, so he tells them what the king told him to tell. Now, a couple of commentators say, well, look, sometimes you just got to fudge the truth. What are some better possible explanations than that?
In the course of that conversation, Jeremiah had actually made that petition. We've seen evidence that he would do so.
Yeah, and the questioners, what right do they have to what happened in that conversation? No right to it, right? And so the likely scenario, as we look at Jeremiah's character, has Jeremiah been one who would say something other than the truth to save his own life? No. That's not, all through this book, that's not Jeremiah's character. And so the notion that we would just, assume that Jeremiah comes out and is so afraid of what might happen to him at this particular moment that he just can't, he fails and tells a lie, I think is a bad assumption on our part. It goes against everything that we know. And I would put this much more into the category of God himself telling Samuel, when he's questioned by Saul, tell him that you are going to make a sacrifice. And that's true. Samuel is going to make a sacrifice when he goes to anoint David as king. It's not all that he's going to do, but that's not Saul's right to that information. And it's not these guys' right to that information. I think sometimes we confuse lying with withholding information, and there are times where it is entirely appropriate to withhold information and to do that in various ways. So we find that happening here. Well, that brings us to chapter 39. Yep.
So what Jeremiah had been preaching is no secret.
Right.
And if he repeated what the king told him to do, the king told him to not tell the people what Jeremiah told them.
Right.
So all that did was he said, I spoke to the king and he doesn't want you to know what I told him, what God said.
Yeah.
Which means if you don't know, go to the king.
Right. It's not like, it's not like Jeremiah hasn't made clear what the word of the Lord is to these. That's why they're angry with him. So they threw him in the cistern to begin with, right? All right. Picking up in chapter 39, Eric, what happens next in these next 10 verses? It happens pretty quickly here in the text. What happens and what's the timeline on when this happened?
It says that in the 9th year of Zedekiah, King Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and all his army came to Jerusalem and laid siege to it. And it says in the 11th year of Zedekiah, the walls were breached, and they came and sat. And he saw that and fled. Zedekiah saw that and fled. They chased after him, killed his sons, all of his sons, blinded him and bound him, and took him back to Babylon.
Yes. All right. So,
Just like you said, the short text.
right. So it's kind of a summary. Here's when they showed up. And then it jumps all the way to the end of that. Here's what happened when they finally breached the gates. Zedekiah is, it is striking to me. Here's a man who refuses to surrender. The gates open and he runs. Right? It's not like he's some bold man standing up. He's not Churchill, right? He's not just standing up and saying, I will die from it. No, I'm taking off. But they go get him, and it's just it's a miserable, pitiful end to this man's cowardly story that he watches helplessly while his sons are put to death. And then that is the last thing that he is privileged to see as his eyes are gouged out. He's put in bronze fetters, and he's led away then to Babylon. And so, as we say, it's a sad story. Who also goes away to Babylon, and who gets left?
Jeremiah primarily despaired his life, and basically they leave the dregs, the poorest people of the land in Jerusalem.
Yeah, so basically they take everybody else except the people who are nobody, right? The people who have nothing. Yeah, you can stay here where there is nothing. It says they give them the vineyards. Basically, whatever's left, they can be left as scavengers, but it's no grace to them. It's not mercy that's being shown to them. It's basically, you wouldn't be of any value to us. And so they take the last of what would be valuable. Remember, at the beginning, the first invasion, who is taken away? The best, right? That's Daniel and his friends. That's the best of what Judah has to offer. They come back for a second raid. Those are taken to where Ezekiel is, to the river Kibar, and they would be, middle class, to use a modern terminology. It's not exactly the way that they might put it, but basically people who have some standing, who still would be considered profitable to have in Babylon. And then here it's, see if there's anybody else, right? And if they've got any strength, if they're going to be any good as slaves, then take them. And then if there's people too weak, then what's the point? I mean, right? It's not, Babylon is not just doing all of this, invading simply to be despotic for its own sake. They're trying to prosper. And so they take who will help them prosper, and they leave everybody else. So this is that third element. We got the first wave, we got the second wave, and we got the what is not really the third wave. But here's Jeremiah. He gives us the perspective of what's left. Who are we told will be delivered from all of this? Who's Jeremiah commanded to tell they will be delivered? Ebed-Melech. I will deliver you on that day, declares Yahweh, and you will not be given into the hand of the men of whom you are terrified, for I will certainly provide you escape, and you will not fall by the sword, but you will have your own life as spoil, because you have trusted me. I want to suggest to you that right there, for the reader in captivity, reading the collected works of Jeremiah, is a gut punch. That here, in the midst of all of this, right, we're getting the final picture. Jerusalem's burning to the ground. All the walls are torn down. But I want to remind you of a man who didn't go through this like you did. His name is Ebed-Melech. And I want to remind you why he didn't. What's that word trust mean? You were faithful. Because you were faithful. They were not. And so they looked to a Gentile for the pattern of how they could have escaped all of this. I think that's pointed. We'll pick up on lesson 11 in chapter 40 on Wednesday night.